Hello, Ruth.
Hello, Lorna.
Nice to see you. So we're just going to hang on for a few seconds just to see if anybody's going to join us before we start our conversation today. So feel free to make yourself a drink, make yourself comfortable, or finish your drink.
I've got my tea going strong.
So we'll make a start. So welcome to anybody who's listening. So this is live, but it's also been recorded, so you can listen again or listen at another time. There's a box for chat, so if you have a question or a comment, then feel free to post it and we'll keep an eye on that. So today we are going to have a conversation about spiritual abuse, religious trauma, and how that might impact our health. So just to let you know a little bit about who I am, I'm Lorna Nicholson. I'm a SIRPA practitioner. My particular client group, I work with a lot of people with fatigue-associated conditions such as POTS, long COVID, MECFS, as well as chronic pain. So my interest in this area, I have been part of the Evangelical Charismatic Church for many years, and more recently have moved away from it and started to think differently about it, and started to realize some of the harm and the good that can come from some of the religious institutions. So partly this is based on some of the beliefs and practices that might occur within this environment. But I've just started to think a lot more, particularly from a trauma perspective, how some of this might be harming people, and especially around health and chronic health conditions, people who I work with. So I have worked with a number of clients who just seem to come my way who have experienced what I refer to as adverse religious experiences. So they might have been part of a religious institution and had an encounter, a conversation, or things that have happened to them that you kind of think, well, that's not great in terms of a nervous system perspective, or it's had an impact on them. So I am working with people who've experienced this in some way or another. So I'd like to hand over to Ruth. Ruth, would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. My name's Ruth Appleton. I am currently training to be a counsellor. I have my own experiences within church as well. Lorna and I are both from the same kind of Christian background. And I have a particular interest in training to work with survivors of spiritual abuse and religious trauma. So yeah, I'm currently on my way to getting there, and I have a particular interest in somatic approaches and how trauma is stored in the body and ways of working with that trauma. And I work for SIRPA as well, so I freelance for SIRPA doing admin and marketing and that kind of thing. So that's how I ended up here.
Thank you. So even though we come from the Christian background perspective, we're fully aware that any religious background will be affected by this, and not just religion or institutions, but it's much wider than this. We're thinking about spirituality, spiritual groups. So it's a really broad subject, but this is a background that we are coming from with this. So Ruth, would you be willing to give us some definitions? So when we think of or use the term spiritual abuse or religious trauma or adverse religious experiences, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, great question. So I'll start with spiritual abuse. One of the best definitions I've found of spiritual abuse actually comes from the Church of England. And it kind of breaks it down into three things. So spiritual abuse is a form of emotional and psychological abuse. And it happens when spiritual beliefs and practices So the teachings, the scriptures, the ideas and the doctrines of any particular spirituality. And this doesn't have to be a religious spirituality, like Lorna says. This can be, there's lots of New Age groups or personal development groups who are also highly spiritually abusive, as there are many that are very helpful. So this isn't just in religious institutions. This is anywhere that spirituality and people's beliefs and practices are involved. So it happens in a spiritual context. Spiritual beliefs and practices are misused and abused in a coercive way. And then this abuse is justified on claims to rightness or God's will or scripture. So, there'll be spiritual beliefs and ideas and practices, used in a way that is coercive, controlling, and abusive. And this will be justified on the grounds of this is the way, this is the path to enlightenment, this is God's will, this is what the Bible says, basically. So that's spiritual abuse. And spiritual abuse then goes on to cause religious trauma. So religious trauma is the impact that the abuse can have on a person or people. So religious trauma is just like any other form of trauma in that it impacts people in a huge variety of ways. It's quite diverse, and that impact happens on a nervous system level, body level. It will trigger a fight, fright, freeze response or a fawn response, just like all forms of trauma. But Marlene Winell, back in 2011, coined the term religious trauma syndrome to kind of argue that religious trauma is a particular form of trauma and to raise awareness of it because it hasn't really been talked about before. Now, I don't think syndrome is very diagnostically accurate because the term syndrome suggests a very narrow list of symptoms. And what we know about trauma, like I've said, is it impacts people in a huge variety of ways. But Winell compares religious trauma to a combination of PTSD and complex PTSD in that it impacts people on multiple levels. It impacts them cognitively, things like disorientation and confusion and flashbacks and disassociation. It affects them emotionally as well. There's grief, there's anger, there's rage, there's the inability to emotionally regulate. It impacts them socially, so they will often struggle to integrate with society, and it can fracture families, relationships, and when you lose your community, your religious community, your religious group, that's often inherently traumatic as well, and it can impact people financially as well. So you can lose your kind of job security, your financial stability. So just like PTSD, it impacts people in a huge, across their life. It's not just religious trauma isn't just about a faith crisis or a loss of faith. It impacts people in a huge variety of ways. So yeah, that's how I define spiritual abuse and religious trauma.
Okay, thank you for that. And it's very much, it's a spectrum. There's loads of people who are out there who've kind of brushed against this in some way, had an experience that have they've just thought, oh, I feel uncomfortable with that. That doesn't feel right. So there's kind of that level. And then there's those who have had ongoing, prolonged, persistent spiritual abuse. So a lot of my clients have been they've had a bit of an experience. For some of those clients, they haven't been traumatized by it. It hasn't had a deep impact on the nervous system. Some it has, but some of the things they've said, it's like, oh yeah, that isn't, yes, that you have experienced spiritual abuse, even though you weren't necessarily traumatized by that experience. It's just a fact that they've been able to make some sense of it at the time. So loads of people have brushed against it in some way or another.
Yeah. I think that's really true. I think it's important to recognize the kind of spectrum of it. A lot of the literature focuses quite on the extreme end, so like cult theory and that kind of thing focuses on quite the extreme end of the spectrum. But spiritual abuse can happen in a huge variety of ways, and the trauma can be small or it can be all-encompassing and really quite large. So Lorna, do you want to talk us through a little bit how it might look if you've experienced religious trauma, some examples of things you've worked with, how it kind of manifests in people's daily lives?
So, I mean, this is super broad, and pretty much any physical symptom might be rooted in having had this experience. So what we do know with the clients that we work with the mind-body TMS symptoms, which can be, it's so broad as we know. We know these symptoms and chronic pain are rooted in trauma or current life stresses, personality traits, types, and adverse events that have happened, childhood trauma, acute trauma. And from that, we know that somebody who's experienced spiritual abuse or religious trauma, there is a chance that they could develop some of these symptoms as well. So you've got the physical symptoms, you've got anxiety, depression, nervous system dysregulation, sleep problems. So it's super broad. One of the themes I see in people who have are kind of have physical symptoms that I've worked with and have come experienced spiritual abuse or brushed against it in some way, or come from the sort of hold certain religious beliefs. It is shame. That's a really common theme that I see. This perfectionist trait, need to do things perfectly, need to do things well. I'm defective, I'm bad. In the Christian setting, some people, the teaching might be, I'm a sinner. So people hold on to that belief that I'm bad, I'm a sinner. I'm not deserving. I don't deserve to be loved. I'm a disappointment, maybe in the eyes of God. And guilt is a common theme with this. And so sometimes this sort of the whole belief system that it is where some of this sense of shame can come from. And often this belief system is quite dualistic, right, wrong, good, bad, you're in, you're out, which can have an impact on one's nervous system, sense of self and identity. Or another example, the Christian theology of hell, heaven and hell, in, out. So some of the beliefs around that might influence.
Yeah, I think you're really right. And I think it's important, like, to acknowledge that no, like, religious beliefs and practices themselves aren't inherently toxic, I don't think. I mean, some misinterpreted and taken out of context, and yeah, it's a spectrum. I don't think kind of theology itself or beliefs themselves are necessarily inherently abusive. I think it's when they're used in ways that are coercive and controlling. So if someone threatens you with hell to try and get you to do what they want, that is where it tips over into spiritual abuse. I think, yeah, there are ways. I'm cautious to say that the belief in hell is inherently toxic. I think I personally know some people who do hold a deep belief in some kind of justice in the afterlife, and they hold it really beautifully and with a lot of nuance and a lot of balance, and it informs a much broader love-informed belief system. However, I do think that the way it's often used in our history, in our society, and in that kind of thing is can be really coercive and controlling. And that's a really important distinction with spiritual abuse. It's, you know, I do talk to people who are like, oh, you know, thank goodness I wasn't raised religiously. And I'm like, no, like, I loved being raised religiously. There are some real benefits I see in my life to growing up in a, you know, a vibrant Christian community. And kind of there's amazing community that come with these things. There's a sense of purpose and belonging and meaning that I needed at that point in my life, and it created a lot of safety for me. However, it's when these things are used coercively and controllingly and manipulatively that it tips over into spiritual abuse, and becomes really harmful and toxic for people who are involved. So what does this look like from a mind-body perspective, Lorna? Like, if you're working with someone who's got chronic pain, how does this kind of manifest, you know, in terms of SIRPA-y stuff?
In terms of how somebody might present?
Yeah, or yeah, the kind of process that they go on, the journey they go on with their mind-body symptoms. I know it's probably very diverse.
Not quite sure how to answer that question. So the symptoms can be super broad, as I've said. So any symptom could be any physical or anxiety, depression could be part of this. So in terms of something that I have been thinking about quite a lot is how and why these spiritual practices and beliefs might be holding somebody back from healing. And this is something that I've seen quite a lot not quite a lot, well, I have seen it. There's a term that was coined by a psychotherapist called John Wellwood, called spiritual bypassing. And spiritual bypassing is quite a good way to explain some of what actually happens, why people are traumatized by this. And the definition is a tendency to use spiritual ideas and practices to sidestep or avoid facing unresolved emotional issues, psychological wounds, and unfinished development tasks. So it's a bypassing. It's a let's use a spiritual practice to not do our inner work. So an example of that is if somebody holds the belief that God is going to heal me, and if only I carried out this spiritual practice more, if I went to church more, if I attended this meeting more, if I read the Bible more or other spiritual books more, then God will heal me. And what that does, it bypasses. I've heard people say they're kind of unwilling to address the unresolved stuff and trauma from their past. If I just focus on God, rather than turning inward to myself to address this trauma. So that's a really good, that's kind of what spiritual bypassing is. And emotions, bypassing emotions. Sometimes there's a belief that emotions are bad. So do not fear. Anger is bad. Anger is wrong. So there's some of the beliefs that people might come my way with and we have a conversation with. And as a result, these emotions are suppressed. But in this work, it's about identifying emotions, understanding that all emotions are there to be experienced and are good. Some are more pleasant than others. Some are more high energy, low energy, and that's okay. And we want to allow the full expression of emotions rather than suppressing certain emotions. So sometimes when I work with people, some of these emotions, it's like their belief is, I'm not allowed to feel this. So this is, again, the spiritual bypassing. So that's a big part of it. And this can lead to what we call disembodiment. So a kind of disconnection from your body. We know that emotions are held in the body. The body becomes a scary place to be. We're stuck in our head. Don't trust your body. Your body is bad. Unable to trust yourself, unable to trust your emotions. Pleasure is bad. So these are some of the things that I might encounter. So it's kind of this disconnection from head to body. So part of the work I do is helping people come out of their head back into their body, and the body is okay and it's safe and it's not bad. And lack of self-compassion is a big part of this. People come and it's like, I'm not allowed to be kind to myself. I need to be doing, I need to be working, I need to be serving. So it's giving people permission to love themselves rather than being stuck in their head, doing everything for other people. So again, some of the personality traits are the people pleasers, the helper, rescuer, want to do everything for everybody else but neglect themselves in the meantime, or all about service doing. And the other thing that I find quite sad is that certain sort of helpful practices such as yoga, mindfulness, meditation, acupuncture, some of these what might be seen as alternative therapies from some of the religious institutions are not encouraged, not promoted. But some of the sort of alternative therapies might actually really help an individual. So yoga is a really good example of that it won't help everybody, and some of these practices are quite triggering for some people, but it's when they're actively disencouraged concerns me quite a lot, that actually all these alternative practices have their place. It's usually not the whole part of somebody's healing journey, but they're not necessarily bad or wrong or demonic or whatever term you want to use with it.
Yeah, and that can go even further in spiritually abusive cases. I know of people who have been actively discouraged from seeking therapeutic help from a counsellor or whatever, because these things should be resolved inside the church, or even people who have declined to go or been told they shouldn't. Actually, if someone declines to go out their own authentic belief system, that's a very different thing as if someone is told on scriptural authority that it's wrong for them to seek medical support for cancer because God's going to heal them. That kind of thing. These stories do exist, and they often have really sad endings. So I think spiritual abuse works because the whole point of spiritual abuse is to undermine someone's own belief in themselves, in their own confidence, in order that they become someone who's more aligned with the group and with the group's ideals and the group's priorities. So, and again, scripture and beliefs and practices are used to justify this. So the idea of having the mind of Christ or becoming more Christ-like was used in my experience to justify the disconnecting with one's authentic self to become more of who the church say you should be. And I think this is where spiritual abuse really begins to kind of chip away at someone's self-worth, self-belief. You become less connected to your authentic self, to your own inner voice, which, some people would say that's God inside you, wouldn't they? Like even within Christian theology that exists, the idea of God inside here. But you are taught that you can't trust yourself, you can't trust your body, you can't trust your own sensations, you can't trust your own emotions, you can't trust any of that. And instead, the only thing you can trust is external sources of authority, so scripture or leadership and that kind of thing. So it chips away your connection to your authentic self, your confidence in yourself, and your ability to make decisions for yourself, perhaps. You might feel quite dependent upon leadership or upon, seeking answers from scripture all the time, rather than just actually being an adult and trusting your gut. So yeah, it can keep you in quite a state of disempowerment, dependence, and yeah, unhealthy internal world in that way. I think that's a key part of what spiritual abuse does. And I think a lot of that is in what you're saying, Lorna, about feeling that guilt, that shame, that sense of powerlessness. That sense of unease.
So, Ruth, a question for you. What does healing look like?
It's a really good question. I really like a model by a woman called Gilly Jenkinson, who's done a lot about spiritual abuse here in the UK. And she's kind of developed a model for what recovery from spiritual abuse and religious trauma looks like. And it's quite similar in some ways to the healing process of recovery from an abusive one-on-one relationship. A lot of because it's a form of emotional and psychological abuse, it looks quite similar to kind of a one-on-one coercive controlling relationship. It's just that you might be it's in the context of a group rather than one-on-one. So Gilly Jenkinson talks about 4 different steps towards healing. The first is that you need distance from the group. So you need to not be under the influence of their teaching anymore. You need to be with different people, that kind of thing. You need some form of distance so that you can begin to think for yourself and you can be safe. And I think it's really important as well, as part of this step, that you are stable, you have a roof over your head. It varies in severity. For a lot of people this won't be the issue, but for some, getting out of the group, if it's more like a closed kind of community, if it is kind of further down the spectrum towards being more like a cult, getting financial independence might be a really important step here. Getting somewhere to live that's not part of communal living will be really important. And we're talking the extreme end of the spectrum here, but there is something about, you need to be stable, you need a roof over your head, you need some kind of source of income before you can begin to process any kind of trauma, because otherwise you'll become destabilized as you process, and you'll become tipped back over into a more kind of frazzled, destabilized state of mind, and you're more likely to go back to the group. So there needs to be some form of stability and some form of distance before you can really begin to do any work. And then the next step is psychoeducation. So that means understanding that what happened wasn't necessarily right or good or healthy. So that might just look like simply, it might just be in one area. So like we've already said, you might have struggle accessing your anger because you've been taught that anger is a sin, perhaps. So it might be as simple as learning and reading and educating yourself that anger is not bad. And that might come through therapy. It might come through somewhere kind of still within your belief system. So I know a lot of people within Christianity at the moment are seeking alternative interpretations of scripture and that kind of thing, that will bring a more expansiveness and move away from kind of some of the narrower evangelical teachings. So you might read alternative interpretations of scripture and open yourself up to the idea that, the Bible can be interpreted in many different ways, for example, and then that might lead you to understand from a biblical perspective that anger isn't a sin. It doesn't have to be seen as a sin. There are lots of ways to interpret that point of scripture. Or it might come secularly through doing inner work, through whatever it might be. But there needs to become that learning, that understanding, because what spirituality does, all spirituality, it kind of changes the way we think. It produces belief systems, and these belief systems, everyone has a belief system, and all of our belief systems are shaped by loads of different influences. If you've been in a spiritual environment, your belief system will largely be shaped by your spirituality and your practices. If these practices have been really healthy and beautiful, that's great. You'll have probably quite a healthy spiritual belief system. And if that belief system has kind of been chosen by you in touch with like your authentic self, great, that's beautiful. If it's been something that's been kind of introjected, to use a therapeutic term, if it's been something that through thought reform or fear or indoctrination has been implanted into your psyche in order to try and manipulate and control you, that belief system will not be healthy and it will not be helping you, but it will still be influencing all of your thoughts, all of your actions. And before you can get to any of the trauma that's stored in your body underneath, this belief system needs to be dismantled and analyzed, because like Lorna said, how can you access the trauma if you believe that it's wrong? You'll continue to spiritually bypass it. If you believe that you shouldn't look at your own problems, you should only fix your eyes on Jesus, you'll continually spiritually bypass it, and you won't actually be able to get in touch with it without it triggering a trauma, like a kind of fight, flight, freeze response. I remember kind of when I first began to get in touch with my anger, for example, I would completely go into freeze and shut down. And this is common for a lot of people, not just in a religious setting, but it had a religious overtone for me because I learned that anger was bad in a religious environment. So I would get in touch with my anger and then I'd immediately go into freeze because I'd learned that anger is a sin. So, and that made me unsafe. Sin is not a safe place to be. So before I could even get in touch with my anger, I had to change my thinking. I had to change what was going on cognitively so that I no longer believed that anger was bad. So that's, the second step. Firstly, you have to get safe. You have to have some kind of stability. You need some kind of distance from the group so you can begin to think for yourself. And then the beliefs need to be analysed and dismantled a little bit, so you can begin to break down that kind of coercive, shut down pressure that's been interjected from the group, if it's been unhealthy. And then the actual real beliefs, the real emotions that will be underneath your natural anger, your natural sense of powerlessness and despair, as well as all your authenticity, who you really are, the wonderful things that are inside of you, all of that's inside too. So yeah, that's the next step. And then once that belief system's kind of no longer exerting the same amount of pressure over you, then you can begin to work with the emotions, with the trauma, with the fear, with the pain. And that's a lot of somatic work comes in at this stage, really being present kind of with your body, and with the grief and the pain. There might be a lot of things to grieve. There might be, you may have lost years of yourself to a group, or donated lots of money to a group that you realize was not actually acting in your best interests. You might have made huge life choices on the advice of a group, or did certain things that you now regret, and you realize that you were part of perpetuating the harm in lives of others. There might be a lot of things that are painful for you to acknowledge as part of this process. And so all of those emotions need to be held. There needs to be space for them. And the trauma, the kind of imprints of fight, flight, freeze and all of that need to be worked through as well. And then slowly, as you go through this process of kind of the deeper layer of healing, and it's iterative, it's not linear, you'll bounce back, like you'll realize, oh, there's still a belief up here that's like, meaning I can't get in touch with this emotion or this trauma or whatever. You'll have to bounce back and do some more like cognitive processing, and then you'll be able to access the trauma, the emotions underneath again. And slowly, as you kind of cycle like this, slowly, then will begin to emerge a greater sense of self, a greater sense of self-confidence. You'll begin to know what you really think about some things, and what you really believe about some things, and a more true, authentic sense of self will slowly begin to emerge. That's no longer, completely controlled by all of these ideas and beliefs that have been interjected from the group. The Gilly uses the phrase post-traumatic growth at this point. So some people will be able to recognize post-traumatic growth, and she even talks about some people saying, that they wouldn't change what had happened to them because it's made them who they are now. Now I'm very I love that. I don't love that at the same time. I think that can be quite hard for someone to hear that that's the destination. It all sounds very cut and dried, and it's not a linear journey for many people, and it's complex and messy. But some people do really recognize the growth and the journey they've been on after a certain amount of time. They're like, oh wow, look at how I've grown, look at how far I've come from where I was when I was part of the group to where I am now. So that's kind of the journey of healing. There's this sense of you need distance and safety. Then you need to start to deconstruct all of this ideology, all of these belief systems, and kind of go, wait, what do I really think? What actually makes sense? And then you can get in touch with the pain underneath and the emotion. And as you do that, your authentic self begins to emerge in your real identity. So that's kind of a little bit about what healing can look like. Do you have anything to say about how the mind-body approach fits in with that? Obviously, we've kind of said it happens at stage 3 when you're really working with the emotions. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Lorna.
Yeah, I mean, you've described really well how I would actually work with somebody, but I'll just share it from my perspective. The first thing to think about is people who particularly have grown up in a sort of strict religious background environment. So it's people who what we call developmental religious trauma. So quite strong belief systems, quite rule-based. Again, sort of in outright wrong, can't do this type environment. You kind of grow up with a very strong, what I call, I suppose, structure belief system scaffolding, I call it. And that scaffolding has actually held you safe throughout your whole life. So my first thing is I don't want to take that scaffolding down. It will dismantle when that person is ready. They need to feel safe. But it's treating that very carefully and kindly, because it's holding up. That's their scaffolding. It's holding them up. It's keeping them safe. So the way I work with people is starting off cognitively. So think about safety first of all, then working cognitively. So with these belief systems and structures, they might be ready to start dismantling them, but they might not. And if they're not ready, then it's like leave it for the time being. You might need to then come back to it and work on this cognitively. I sort of kind of send. I don't necessarily have the knowledge myself, but I've got lots of resources that I direct people to. I might say, have a look at this, and just come back and tell me what you think about it, or consider reading this book and let me know what you think. And they'll either go there or they won't, and that's absolutely fine. So there's working cognitively, and then there's working emotionally, so tapping into the emotions, emotional awareness, emotional intelligence, giving them permission to feel their emotions, pendulating in and out of emotions if they're emotions that they haven't felt, maybe never, not allowed to. And then I work somatically. So it's kind of working with the felt sense, the traumatic imprints that they might hold because of all of this. And it's also tapping into what Ruth is saying, tapping into your authentic self. So sometimes when a person, they start this work, so kind of part of the belief system structure, religious background, whatever that they come with, park that for the time being, start doing this work from an emotional level, they start to tap into who they really are, their authentic self. And then they start to feel safe to then start going back and asking the questions and to start to slowly dismantle their scaffolding, if that's the right thing to do for them. So authenticity, tapping into intuition, Ruth mentioned that. Trusting your heart, trusting your gut. Often because of this mind-body disconnect, it's people come with a, no, I can't trust my heart, I can't trust my gut, based on the belief systems. So when they can start to say, no, I can trust my gut instinct, my heart, tap into heart's intelligence. And when they start to do that, then some of these other parts, these structures can start to be dismantled, and there's safety to do that. So that's kind of what I'm seeing. Yeah, I mean, long term, I would love to see some research done on the influence of spiritual abuse, religious trauma on health, and it would be fascinating to know, how many people with the symptoms that we work with can be rooted back to some form of developmental religious trauma or adverse religious experiences. So that's my wish to see in the future, if there's any researchers out there.
Yeah, totally. And I also think like the generational trauma could be huge with it as well. Like I think, having parents and grandparents who are, caught up in all of this stuff, and obviously there's a lot of that kind of reaching the news about certain institutions, kind of historical abuse that's happened over generations, and I think that can have a real impact as well on a person's psyche and their nervous system as well.
Yeah, and I've seen that. It might not be the client I'm working with who has been, they haven't been brought up in a religious environment, but their grandparents did, who brought up their dad, who had an influence on their upbringing. So it kind of goes back down the generations, and so the whole generational trauma is quite big with this as well. So, question for you, Ruth. If you know somebody who is in a religious group or a spiritual group who've experienced some sort of religious trauma, spiritual abuse, what advice could you give to family, friends?
Yeah, you know, some people say that for every person who gets groomed into a spiritually abusive group, there are numerous other victims as well, who are the like loving friends and family who are stood around watching, feeling helpless as someone, their personality changes, and they begin changing in ways. And you can, from the outside, you can often see it as this process happens. You can see that actually what's happening is harmful, but the person inside the group is subject to that kind of indoctrination. So they believe that what's happening to them is God's will, or it's the path to enlightenment, or it's the route to personal transformation. But you might be sat on the outside going, oh my gosh, I'm frightened. And I think the first thing to know, if that's you, you're not alone. There are kind of websites and forums and support groups out there online that you can search for others who are also worried about other people in these kind of groups. But it was interesting what you said, Lorna, about how safety first is so important. And as someone feels safe, then the structures and the beliefs oftentimes will begin to unravel. And I think that's so true. I think when we know someone in whatever capacity who is currently under the influence of a spiritually abusive group, one of the most important things we can do is just hold a safe space for that person, help them know that they are unconditionally loved and accepted in this space. Because what you'll find in these groups is that unconditional love and acceptance doesn't really exist. You're only safe and you're only accepted if you become who the group wants you to be. So for someone who's in that kind of environment, having a place that feels unconditional can be incredibly powerful. And that in itself can oftentimes help someone get in touch with their own emotions and their own doubts and fears. So from a family or friend's point of view, I think what that looks like often is it can be really difficult. It's not getting into arguments about, is the group right or wrong, or is it good or bad? Because that puts the person in the group in a really difficult position. You know, the pressure of, doing God's will or finding enlightenment is incredibly compelling. So if you're able to, and within boundaries that you need to look after yourself, if you're able just to ask curious questions, gather information, and you can say, that doesn't feel comfortable to me. You don't have to just lie outright or pretend that you're really on board with what the group's doing. But if you can avoid getting into real conflict about it and creating a space that's like just accepting and loving and safe and affirming your love for them as an individual as often as you can, that can often begin a process of that person getting back in touch with something of themselves and feeling safe enough to actually express their doubts and their questions and their fears. And yeah, most people do leave. Most people in the end, if they are subject to real spiritual abuse, in the end, most do leave. And it can take time and it can take patience just to be there and continue holding space. And yeah, you will probably need support yourself, places to vent, places to let your own frustration out. But if it can be not at the person, if you're able to get enough resourcing elsewhere, that when you're with the individual, you're just able to hold a real safe space. I think that's often the most beneficial thing that people can do. Because it really is, Lorna, you're so right. Creating that sense of safety where someone can begin to access their authenticity is honestly one of the most powerful healing things that can happen in cases of spiritual abuse, because spiritual abuse undermines that authenticity and it undermines our sense of self and our autonomy and our freedom. It is that psychological and emotional coercive control that happens. And one thing that I often get asked as well, actually, is do people continue to have a faith after experiencing spiritual abuse? Do people just leave and never come back, or do some people continue spiritually? And I think, I don't know if you'd agree, Lorna, but I think that looks different for everyone, and everyone's got their own journey and their own process. And it really is a process as someone figures out what they believe, what they think. Some people choose to remain affiliated with a particular religion. Others call themselves spiritual but not religious. Others become atheist. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Lorna.
No, I agree with you. Across the spectrum, very individual. Any of that can happen.
Yeah. But what I do think happens is people develop a radar so that they can tell what is or isn't healthy. If they have heels, sometimes people can bounce from spiritually abusive group to spiritually abusive group, just like people can from coercive relationship to coercive relationship. But if the healing's happened and that pattern is broken, oftentimes if people do choose to remain, they'll only remain if it's not compromising their autonomy, if it's a healthy spiritual group. And it must be said that some spiritual groups are incredibly healthy and really do bring some huge benefits for people. The community that exists, the sense of meaning, sense of purpose. A lot of religious groups do incredible things in the community. This isn't to say that all religion is bad by any means, but it's just to highlight that I think spirituality and religion does have a particular influence that can be twisted and used in an abusive way, and that really needs to be recognized if we're going to keep spirituality and religion safe.
And are there any helplines, resources that people could be directed to?
It's a really good question. Yes, not as many as I would love for there to be, let's be honest. There's Ginny Jenkinson, who I've already mentioned as kind of the one who developed the modality for healing that I draw on. She has developed this modality and trained a number of therapists in it. So you can find that at hopevalleycounselling.com. She's UK based. I think she's trained people in the US as well. There are a number of counsellors in the US as well that can just be Googled. I'm not sure in other countries. There's also in the UK specifically, there's a support line for survivors of spiritual abuse and religious trauma that's open, I think, 1 or 2 days a week. And that's called Replenished Life. And that's a multi-faith support line for survivors from any faith or spiritual group. And they work in a more baseline level. Some people aren't ready for therapy. Some people need support kind of just getting stable. Replenished Life also kind of journeys with people if they are considering raising some kind of safeguarding complaint with a religious group or organization, and can help support people through that process as well. So if that's something that someone is weighing up, do I raise this, do I not, or even was I even spiritually abused? These are things that Replenished Life are really helpful for processing. But it's not therapy, and they will refer on if something becomes out of their scope. So those are a couple of resources, mainly UK based, where I am, that are really helpful. And if anyone else knows of others, please put them in the chat. That'd be great.
Great. Do you have any final last words? Anything else that you feel you want to cover?
I don't think so. I guess only just to say that I think this is a growing area that people are having conversations about, and I think there's growing awareness of it as an issue. And I'm hopeful that the more we talk about it and the more we raise awareness, the more people will have their experiences validated. There are so many people walking around who experience spiritual abuse but don't even know that it is a thing, and are carrying trauma from spiritual experiences, of belonging to spiritual groups, but don't even know what that was. So I am hopeful that in the next few years there will be more discussion, more discourse, more dialogue, and maybe more recognition in healthcare and statutory services as well of what this means. I think that can often be a real challenge, that it's not recognised as a form of abuse, particularly, or trauma, by kind of healthcare, the NHS, all sorts of social services. There's a real lack of understanding. So, but it's growing. There's real survivor movement growing and advocating. So hopefully we'll see some change. But yeah, what about you, Lorna? Do you have any last words?
No, not in particular. Just I'd love to see some research on the link between religious trauma and health. And like you say, Ruth, the growing awareness and understanding and continued conversations would be really good to continue have.
Yeah, Yeah, I quite agree.
Yeah.
Cool.
Anyway, we will finish there. We can continue this conversation on Facebook. So if you're listening later, feel free to comment, and we will answer as best we can. Thank you to everybody who's joined us today.
Great. Thanks, everyone.